All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Kate Duvall. I'm the president of Piedmont CASA here in town, and I'm really happy to be joined today by Gail Esterman of ReadyKids. Gail will be leading this webinar and really educating us all about the challenges of finding affordable, accessible, high quality childcare in our community. And before you joined, Gail and I were just talking about how high of a hurdle that can be. And I was saying, even from my very privileged position as a parent with a co-parent who were both employed, gosh, childcare for our two kiddos at that time was really hard and the source of a lot of stress for us. And we really enjoy a lot of privilege that folks in our community don't. Childcare costs in our community can run between $9,000 and $12,000 a year. And so for families living in poverty, it's really a struggle not only to meet just their basic needs, but to pay those costs associated with employment like childcare. And so Gail's going to give us an overview of the childcare landscape in our community and issues related thereto, and also resources for families that are struggling to afford services. I'll tell you a little bit about Gail, but then I'm going to turn it over to her. So Gail Esterman is the director of early learning at ReadyKids, which is a Charlottesville-based nonprofit currently celebrating its 100th anniversary. That's amazing. That's so fantastic. She leads a team of early learning specialists who provide consultation, training, program assessment, and individualized classroom skill coaching to hundreds of early childhood educators and program directors in the greater Charlottesville area to improve the quality of the care and support they offer to nearly 5,000 young children and their families annually. And I could go on and on and on, but I know what you really want to hear is what Gail has to say. So I will turn the floor over to Gail. Thanks so much, Gail.
Thank you, Kate. I'm going to share my screen here. Just give me 1 second. I am really happy to be here with everybody today. I appreciate the opportunity. And as I was saying to Kate, when we spoke, that people sometimes think that because childcare involves small children, that it's not very complicated, but in fact, it's a very, very complicated system, both for families and for childcare providers. So I'm happy to have the opportunity to try to illuminate this system for everybody today. I have a lot that I'm going to try to pack into the presentation, and then at the end there will be time for questions and answers. Kate is going to be monitoring the chat, and we agreed that if there was a question that just seems really crucial to answer in the moment, she may interrupt me, but otherwise we will try to save questions for the end. So please feel free to put them in so that she can gather them up at the end. Okay, so let me just move this a little bit. This is a quote from September 2021 report from our Treasury Department showing that the US childcare system overburdens families and causes shortages due to an inadequate supply. And they said it's a market failure, unworkable. So I added this because to understand what's happening for families needing out-of-home care for young children, we really need to understand the system that drives their choices and experiences. So I'll ask a question. Is childcare a public service, or is it a private enterprise that should be driven by market forces? I'm not an economist, but this report states clearly that the current system is unworkable. When parents can't afford the cost of childcare, programs shut down. And just to give a little perspective, other developed countries spend on average $14,000 a year for toddler care, while the US spends between $500 and $1,000. So I want to just explain a little bit of terminology. We use the term early childhood care and education to recognize that birth to 5 care is also early childhood education. And there's no positive learning without a trusting, caring relationship between the caregiver and educator and the child. So both the care and the education functions should be respected and funded. We also use the term childcare instead of daycare to more accurately capture that adults are caring for children, not caring for a day. So that's just some terminology you'll be hearing me use. So the lack of public investment has created childcare deserts, leaving families unable to find care and providers unable to stay afloat. And this was true before COVID. So I'm going to talk some about the impact of COVID, but I just want everybody to be aware that many of the factors that have contributed to what we're seeing in the headlines right now all the time, these were long-standing tensions in the system. When we talk about childcare deserts, that's defined by there being more than 3 children needing 1 available licensed childcare slot. So 51% of the country is said to have childcare deserts. That's especially true in rural areas and areas where there's high numbers of Latino and Hispanic population. And you'll see some of that when we look at some of the contrast between Charlottesville and Albemarle versus Louisa and Greene. I know that's CASA's area. And so you'll see some of how that plays out in Louisa and Greene, which is a more rural area. Early childhood care and education is part of the Biden agenda to build back better by relieving families of the out of reach costs of care. In this plan, no family would pay more than 7% of their salary for those earning up to double the state's median. So childcare, early childhood care and education is a workforce issue. It's also an equity issue and a child development issue. As a workforce issue, without getting too political, one way of looking at it is we just passed this big infrastructure bill, but who's going to work in the factories and the construction sites to build the bridges and fix the highways? You can't have needs and infrastructure without having childcare so that the economy can thrive. And I think that's being brought home right now, but it's just interesting how these two sides of our national functioning have been divided politically. It's also an equity issue. More affluent parents can afford high quality care, so that leaves their children more set up for school than less affluent parents. It's important to understand that what we call the achievement gap is actually an opportunity gap. When you see some of the information I'm going to provide, you're going to start to see why many children end up in kindergarten without having had an early childhood group experience, and they start out at a distinct disadvantage from their peers. It's not the fault of their family. Our system is not set up for everybody to have an equal shot. And finally, it's a child development issue. High quality childcare supports the development of language, cognitive, social, emotional regulation, all these skills that are needed to be great citizens and functioning members of society. Everybody benefits when children's development is supported. So that's a little bit of a framework. So my goals for today are to help you learn about how the system works and doesn't work for families and providers. We'll talk about types of care, funding, access, quality, and some resources for families. And if you're working with families, I hope that you'll make use of these resources. And I'm happy, I don't know if this will work, Kate and I didn't talk about it, but to send a list of them with an annotated list with websites and things that she could send out to people, or we could include wherever this is posted.
We can do that, Gail. That's a great idea.
Great, okay. So I wanted to just give a little historical snapshot of how we got to where we are today. I was a history major in college, so you'll see this coming through. And I'm a social worker by training. So I look at, big systems in history and context. So I would say that this history is defined in this country by real ambivalence about the reality of mothers working outside of the home, especially white mothers. If we look back to slavery, we know that Black enslaved women cared for the children of white families without any compensation, while forced to neglect the needs of their own children, who were sometimes sold away and lived in violence. So right there, we have our economy built on the labor of enslaved women. In 1893, the Federation of Day Nurseries was set up. This was the first national organization devoted to the issue of childcare. They set up model classrooms to demonstrate what optimal care should look like. So as far back as 1893, there were discussions about what this would look like. In 1930, mothers' pensions were created to support poor women staying home with children rather than having to be in the workforce. However, Black women were usually denied benefits in the North as well as the South on the grounds that they, unlike white women, were accustomed to working for wages and should not be encouraged to stay home to rear their children. In 1942, the Lanham Act created a nationalized system, particularly in areas where there was war industry, because women had to go into the workforce because men were at war. So we were able to do it as a country. We recognized women needed to work to contribute to our economy, support their families. And then when the war ended, the system ended. And then back in 1971, there was actually bipartisan support for a bill sponsored by Mondale, the Comprehensive Child Development Act, that also recognized the benefits of high quality care and nutrition services and supports for working families. It was vetoed by Nixon. And I found this great quote. Nixon ominously warned that this bill would commit the vast moral authority of the national government to the side of communal approaches to child rearing against the family-centered approach. So the opposition to this usually has a political agenda that, we do have the capacity to develop a better system if we want to, but there are people who oppose it. And this is a picture from 1947 in New York, a protest when they did end the system that had been developed to support women in the workforce. I just thought this was a great picture to show how many people, Black and white, were saying that we need childcare in order to lift our families out of poverty in order to be able to work. So looking at today, how is the system funded? This is, as I said at the beginning, basically a private system. Families at this point pay on the average 13% of their income for childcare tuition, for payments. The economists say that 7% of somebody's income is considered affordable. Usually, when we think about this, families with young children are usually at the beginning of their careers. So they're starting out. They're often in entry-level positions, whether they went to college or not, they're starting out. They may have student debt, they may have a mortgage payment, they certainly have rent and other expenses, and you can't get loans for childcare like you could for college. So right away, we see that this system, families are only going to be able to pay so much, and they're already paying too much. There's an alphabet soup of federal programs and state programs that do provide some support. So there's the Child Development Fund, there's temporary assistance for needy families, the Social Services Block Grant, there's a food program, there's Head Start. Those are all federal programs. And just the sheer number of them, you can see that this is patchwork, it's uncoordinated, it's fragmented. That comes down to the state level where you have, some subsidy funds, you have some Head Start funds, you have some funds for the Virginia Preschool Initiative for 3- and 4-year-old programs, but it's not very well coordinated, and it definitely doesn't fund everybody who's eligible. On the local level, there's some supports through the United Way, through the Charlottesville Area Community Fund. I think that's what CICF is. And ReadyKids receives grants to do quality improvement work with programs. So there's all this funding, but it's not, as I said, very well organized. People often ask, why is childcare so expensive? So wages typically make up about 60% of facility costs. So that's labor. You also have rent, utilities, insurance, food, materials, training, and all the HR costs of getting people hired, which are background checks and training and TB tests and various things like that. So at the same time, childcare workers make in the 2nd percentile of all occupations. This workforce is, like 99% women, at least 1/3 women of color. So the average is about $11.60 per hour for people who are caring for young children, responsible for education, nurturing, health and safety. And many of them rely on public funding themselves to meet their own expenses. So many, something like 40% of the early childhood workforce themselves receive TANF and other funds. Turnover is a major cost as a result of this. So there's all these hidden costs in the system because when people aren't making money, they're going to leave the job. So you have to rehire. So the funding for the system is a major issue. Who is in care? This is national data from 2016. It's changed somewhat because of COVID, but not entirely. So about 40% of children under age 6 were cared for solely by their parents. That could be, a stay-at-home parent or 2 working parents cobbling together care. About 60% received on average 30 hours of care weekly from a non-parent. Preschool children are more likely to be outside of the home, with 31% in home-based childcare and 69% in center-based care. So let's think about who's looking for care. I want us to put ourselves in the shoes of the new parent. How soon does that parent need to get back to work? Did they have any kind of paid family leave? What are their work hours? Are they standard hours, 9 to 5? Or do they also have to work some evenings and weekends? Does their shift change week to week? Sometimes they have a morning shift, sometimes they have an evening shift. Is there anything predictable about their schedule? Is the parent healing from a C-section? Is she breastfeeding? Does she have other children? Is her primary language English, or is it another language that is unlikely to be represented in the childcare options available? Does she have a supportive partner and family who can help out in any way? How much can she afford? Does she have transportation, or is she reliant on the bus? Did she budget for registration fees or waitlist fees? Does she have any time to actually make calls and visit programs to see what she thinks before she signs up her child for a program? And who can she ask for recommendations? Does she have a church community, synagogue, a mosque? Does the pediatrician know? Does she have friends? Does she know people in this country? We have a large influx of refugees coming in who may need care. They're disoriented. They don't know who to ask. So some of these challenges, as Kate had said, face all parents, regardless of financial resources. These are not exclusive to low-income families. What I've seen in all the years I've been in this work is that the emphasis, is always so much on pregnancy, labor, delivery, like those first few weeks, and then it's like falling off a cliff because people didn't realize how much they needed to plan ahead. They don't realize the cost. They don't realize how few options there are. And so people joke about needing to get onto wait lists 2 years in advance, but there's much less of a sense of humor when affordable care is out of reach. People really stop laughing quickly. So are there options? So the parent needs to match up, the cost of care, location, the hours. Are there scholarships or subsidy funds available if the parent can't afford the market cost? Does the program respect and understand the parent's culture and willing to dialogue around assumptions they might make about what is best for children? Do they speak the parent's language? You can imagine with a young child, you need to have a lot of conversation when they're in care about their food, about their emotional state, what happened last night that might affect them during the day, about their preferences, comforting them. If you don't speak the language and have somebody at the center who's even making an effort to connect with the parent, that's going to affect care. Does your child have any special needs, any medical needs, developmental needs, or mental health needs? And are there programs that can meet those needs? Is the provider able to take siblings so that the parent has all the children in one place? Or are they having to drive and rush to get 2 children or 3 children to different places on the bus, navigate different hours? So when you start looking at the options, all of a sudden it starts getting narrower or narrower about what your choices are going to actually be. Kate talked about at the beginning that the average annual cost in our region is between $9,000 and $12,000 for care. And this chart shows some of the breakdown. Charlottesville and Albemarle, the average annual cost for a toddler is $13,520. That comes out to monthly $1,127 and an average weekly cost of $260. A little less so in Greene and Louisa, $85.80 for the annual cost, $715 monthly and $165 weekly. That's a lot, for a family making minimum wage. So that gives you some idea of toddler costs. People probably know this, but infant care is the most expensive because you have to have the highest number of ratio of adult to child, 1 adult per 4 infants. So the labor costs are higher, so it's more expensive because infants need more intensive care. Toddler, a little less expensive, preschool, a little less expensive than that. So this is why, there's this range of $9,000 to $12,000. So we talk about childcare subsidy. And I referred to all the different sources of federal funding that go into the subsidy program. So for eligibility, a Virginia resident who is either actively employed or engaged in a job search, participating in an education or training program, receiving child protective services, participating in an assigned activity for the VIEW program, which is a work program for low-income people, or participating in a plan through SNAP, which is a food program, or other social service programs. So there's income eligibility, and then these other aspects of how your case gets reviewed to see if you're going to be eligible for a child care subsidy. It's important to know that I think the statistic is about 1 in 6 people who are eligible actually are funded. So you may be eligible, but either there may not be enough funding or there may not be enough spots. I'm going to just talk about some of the flaws in the subsidy system. So the subsidy does not cover the actual costs of providing care. This is from the provider point of view. It's below the market rate. So families are expected to make up the difference with a copay. And not all families do that. So they're supposed to do that. And it's a lot of work for providers to actually collect that copay. There's cards, the parents have to swipe their cards. It might mean that one parent or somebody in the family is dropping off and somebody else is picking up. There's a lot of additional labor that goes into even collecting the copay. The pay for subsidy is based on attendance, not on enrollment. So if you're doing private childcare, you're probably familiar that you pay for a month. Whereas with subsidy, if the child doesn't attend, the provider doesn't get paid. Subsidy vendors have additional costs. Subsidy vendors are the childcare providers who have gone through the process to become approved to accept the childcare subsidy. There's additional costs that they have to bear compared to other programs. For example, every single person on the site has to be trained in CPR and first aid. That can be anywhere from $50 to $100 on average to get that training. When you think about a 40% turnover rate, that means you're constantly having to train your staff, every single person, to be CPR and first aid ready. So a lot of programs don't want to be subsidy vendors for these reasons, and that narrows that field even more of what's available to that low-income parent who is eligible. Finally, they're also financially incentivized through all of this to accept private pay. So you'll see I have a chart where we could look at on paper who provides subsidized care in our community and what's their licensed capacity. But that doesn't mean all of those slots are going to be used for children with subsidy. In fact, that provider is financially incentivized to accept private pay. So it's a very, very fragile system. Quality. Why does quality matter so much? So I talked earlier about children spending on average of 30 hours a week in care. Sometimes children are in care more than their waking hours that they spend with their families. So the quality of the caregiver, the educator taking care of them is paramount. We know that brain development is tied to those nurturing and engaging adult-child interactions. That back and forth, the attention to cues, the language, the availability, the individualization, that lays the basis for actual brain development. So this birth to 5 period is foundational for future learning. All the research shows that children who attend high quality early childhood programs perform better on grade school tests, stay in school longer, experience lower rates of depression, have better physical health, have higher individual and household earnings. Conversely, poor quality care can actually be detrimental, especially for boys from low-income families. So what does quality look like? A lot of parents don't know. When I think back on my own journey, and even with all of the training I have, I think back when my daughter was young, the questions, it didn't even occur to me to ask. I visited programs, I had a feeling, and I was pretty well informed, but knowing what I know now, I had no idea what I was doing. So What are some of the broadest quality benchmarks? The consistency of the caregiver. Again, that relationship. So having the same person greeting the child in the morning, the person knows the child, they're familiar, they smell the same, they know the child's name, they know the position the child likes to be fed in, they know what the little grunt means. That means they're about to, they have a dirty diaper. That consistency is just the foundation for quality. Opportunities to move bodies and explore a stimulating environment. That doesn't necessarily mean the fanciest high technology. It can mean some cardboard boxes and markers and some soft, cozy areas and books, but it has to be developmentally appropriate. It has to be individualized to that child's needs and development. It has to have caregivers who are assessing the children and understanding what are they working on developmentally and how can they offer supports during the day? How can they put that toy just out of reach so that the infant is trying to turn over and reach the toy and developing their core strength, which is going to have everything to do with their ability to sit in a chair later and use a pen or a pencil or a crayon. You really need people who are going to understand that putting out puzzles that are missing pieces is going to be enormously frustrating, and that the puzzles that were good at the beginning of the year are not good in the middle of the year. The children are tired of them. You need to switch them out. So you really need that training, time for training, and an awareness of the early development standards that drive what's being offered. Low quality care. So this is my team goes into programs all over our area and does assessments and quality improvement. And what are some of the things that alarm us the most? We see babies kept in what we call containers all day long. They're in a crib, they're moved to a bouncy seat, they're moved into a high chair, they're back in the crib. They are not on the floor, rolling around, crawling, able to use their bodies, able to see interesting things, able to sit when they're ready to sit on their own and struggle to do all those things and pull up. The implications of this are really, really negative. Ask any physical therapist and they will tell you. We see caregivers on phones. They're not talking to children. They think that because the babies may not understand language, that it doesn't matter, that you're talking to them, that you're singing to them. We hear sarcasm, we hear threats, we hear punishment. We see children being put in long timeouts. We see long group times with enforced sitting, so asking 2.5-year-olds to sit at a circle time where you're going over the calendar and you're going over the days of the week and you're going over a letter of the week for a toddler when that has no meaning to them, instead of having them experience things that are a sensory experience and talking about what's right in front of them for brief periods of time, or gathering children over to hear a story and sing a song and then get to have choices of what they're doing. We see a lot of inappropriate expectations. And again, that's because there's no time for training built into the system. There's no paid time. And you have a workforce making $11.60 an hour. So you're not getting people who necessarily have the background they need. So for types of care, there's regulated care. It falls into a couple of different areas. The focus of licensing is health and safety. So it's the foundation for quality, but it doesn't necessarily mean quality. In centers, you can have a fully licensed center or a religious exempt center. For home-based care, you can have a licensed family childcare home or a voluntary registered home. That means you can care for up to 4 children in your home. Licensed home means up to 12 children, and centers, it's based on your square footage in terms of the number of children that you can serve. What licensing does is there's an application, there are regulations, there's background checks on staff. inspections, required training. You're required to have children's health records where you're gathering, the immunization reports. You're looking at what the pediatrician may have said about that child. You have emergency contact information for the child. You have first aid CPR training, as I said. There's just, licensing says how many adults you have to have per child. So what kind of supervision, what kind of meals you have to serve. So that's why licensed care is very, very important. However, quality varies. So you can have providers who are licensed. That doesn't mean they're high quality. It means that there may be a level of safety, but parents should, I'll have a resource at the end. They can check violation reports. They can see how that provider, are they chronically being written up for things like lack of supervision, or are there some minor things like maybe they didn't get the most updated immunization report on a child, or something like that. That's more minor, but parents really need to look into that. There's other ways to find out the quality of a program. So I just want to make it clear that licensing is a very important baseline, but there's huge variation in the actual quality. Then you have unregulated care. In Virginia, it is legal to care for up to 4 children in your home without any kind of regulations. So this varies from state to state. In some states, as soon as you're caring for more than 1 child for pay, you have to be fully licensed. So what that means is you have people who don't have background checks. There's no inspection. They may not be collecting individualized information on children. They may not have any health and safety training or educational training. On the other hand, they may be fantastic. So I know that there are unregulated providers in our community who choose not to go through the system. Word of mouth, they have enough children and enough families who use them, and they're great. But on the other hand, there are people doing this who are really not great. They're plopping kids in front of TVs. They have people in and out of the home all day. You don't know, who those other people are. They may leave the children with other people. They may not have any training. They may not have any emergency care and plan in place. So what we often see is that parents are having to cobble together a plan. They may find a program that is open part of the day, but for after school, they leave the child with somebody in the neighborhood who's unregulated. So that's, this combination of what parents have to figure out. I'm trying to talk very fast because I want to leave time for questions. So I hope this is okay and I'm not talking too fast. I want to show for centers, local supply. So in Charlottesville, there are 21 licensed centers that are available. And I want to also note that this does not include 4 centers that only are for UVA faculty and medical personnel at the UVA Health Center. Not the CNAs and the janitors, but the doctors and physicians. So if you look at the list of who's a licensed facility, it looks like there are more, but I purposely went through and eliminated because those are not available to a lot of people in the community and many of the families that people on this Zoom are probably working with. Of those 21 centers, only 5 are subsidy vendors. Of those subsidy vendors, 5 accept toddlers and only 3 serve infants. So you see how what I talked about at the beginning, the options become narrower and narrower and narrower. And while it looks like those 5 subsidy providers could potentially serve 291 children, as I noted, many of those are private pay children. That does not actually mean there are 291 subsidized spots because the provider can't possibly pay for the cost of care only using subsidy. So you see the same thing for Albemarle, 45 licensed programs. So these may be religious exempt, but again, religious exempt may exclude some people if you don't want your child in a Christian-based center. If you're Jewish or agnostic or Muslim, that may not meet your needs, or the style of curriculum may not meet your needs. Some of these programs don't run full day. Some of them don't run full year. So, you know, you have to keep diving into what this actually means. In Albemarle, 17 of those 45 take subsidy, 10, they're all both infant and toddler, 1,271 on paper slots, but nowhere near that in reality. And we come to Greene County, 4 centers, only 2 take subsidy. None of them provide infant care in those subsidy programs. 2 of them also, those 2 do have subsidy. And in Louisa, we have 10 centers, 4 take subsidy, only 2 infant.
Gail, there's a question that I think is pertinent. The question is, could you define religious exempt, that term that you're using?
Yes, so programs that are provided, so not all programs provided in a religious facility are religious exempt. So there are some programs that are housed in like a church, but they're not part of the church's mission. So it's just a licensed facility. They're not doing any type of, you know, religious-based programming. But many programs are part of a church's mission, and they don't have as stringent requirements as licensed programs. So they are allowed to have larger group sizes, for example. They are not held to the same standard. There's a very strong sort of lobby among those providers who, on the one hand, can sometimes offer lower cost because the church subsidizes rent, or they can have larger group sizes, but they are not subject to the same kind of licensing inspections, health and safety inspections, and the same rigor. So again, parents, sometimes these programs are fantastic. You know, there are many I would send my own child to. Sometimes parents get lulled into thinking because it's in a church, it must be great. These are all great people. Not necessarily. They may be well-intentioned people, but they're not necessarily informed people, or they may be just not the best people, and you wouldn't know because they don't have background checks, so they could be hiring somebody with any kind of background. So, you know, I hope that helps. It's just a different designation, but legally in Virginia, you can have people operating under that type of exemption. Another thing I just wanted to note on centers is that Head Start and VPI, Virginia Preschool Initiative, serve 3- and 4-year-olds in our area. In Charlottesville City, you have a program for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. In the county, only 4-year-olds in the public school. So these are eligibility-based programs. They're income-based. There's other risk factors that are taken into consideration, like the parent's education level, if there's an incarcerated parent, if there's been domestic violence, you know, there's a number of risk factors that get considered. They're generally really high quality, but they aren't in every school, you know, so they don't serve every possible child who's eligible. And right now they don't have after school programming. So for a working parent that needs full day, that's a problem. So they're, you know, a wonderful asset in some ways. They have family support. They use high quality curriculum, but even if a family is eligible for them, they may not be able to use them in fact. These are home-based kind of statistics. So in Charlottesville, 14 licensed or voluntarily regulated providers. Of those, 6 subsidy. With home-based, usually they have mixed age groups, so they do have infants, toddlers, preschoolers, and you can see you know, how that plays out. It's a small number. It's a very, very important part of care because they're more affordable. They tend to have more flexible hours. They may be neighborhood based. But in our community in Charlottesville, Albemarle, there's one provider that offers 24/7 care. She opens, her first child comes at 4 in the morning and her last child leaves at midnight. So if you're a parent who needs care during some off hours, you don't have a lot of options. If you need, you know, weekend care, you don't have a lot of options. None of them offer transportation. You know, they can be very important. You can see in Greene County, there's one, and that one is not subsidized. So also not necessarily a great resource. Okay, in just a few minutes, I'm going to sort of race through just some scenarios, case examples. So we have family A finds an affordable licensed home-based provider in their neighborhood who participates in ReadyKids quality improvement programs. She opens at 5 a.m. and closes at 6 p.m. The child thrives. Fantastic. The system worked for that family. Family B, eligible for subsidy, but has to take 2 buses to get to the provider, making the parent chronically late for work. The parent loses their job. Family C is eligible for subsidy. Provider turnover due to low pay means new staff all the time. The child doesn't feel secure, has behavior issues. Parent gets frequent calls midday to pick up the child because the program can't really handle the behavior. Parent is worried they're going to lose the job. They get angry at the child. There's constant tension between the center and the parent, between the parent and the child. Family D is eligible for Head Start or the Virginia Preschool Initiative, which is that preschool in the public school, but there's no after school, so the family can't participate. Family E, a high quality center has openings for both the baby and the preschooler. Children are thriving. Then the center has to quarantine a classroom. So suddenly the parent has to swing into making alternative arrangements in order to go to work or school. Family F uses an unregulated provider who enrolls more than the 4 children allowed. The lack of supervision means the child is coming home with bruises from falls. The teacher or the caregiver isn't paying attention. Family G has a home-based provider and her boyfriend moves in. He has an old felony record. It's 20 years old. He's, you know, got into a assault situation when he was 19 and he was a hothead, but he gets picked up on the background check that's required for everybody living in the home, and the provider gets shut down. So the family is without care. Family H, child needs speech therapy. The school will provide it if the parent can bring the child to the elementary school at 8 a.m. But the parent needs to be work at 7 a.m. So now the child can't get speech therapy because the school system isn't sending speech therapists out to the private providers. This varies by whatever school system, and I can't speak to all of the school systems, but this is a chronic issue. I wanted to briefly say that there's a lot of work in Virginia to solve some of these issues that's going on. It's not fast enough. There's funding changing, hopefully, you know, from the Build Back Better, if that passes, that's going to come into early childhood. There's a new unified system with standards and measurement and expectation that goes across all these different systems for all publicly funded programs, so that home-based programs, center-based private programs, Head Start, VPI, if you're getting public funding, you're being measured and observed and rewarded for high quality teacher-child interactions and use of a curriculum. You're getting resources to improve. Parents, you know, if they have to go between those settings, there's some continuity in the language that's used to assess your children. There's something called mixed delivery, which is working where there's partnerships between the public programs and some community-based programs where if a child, say, is eligible for the public pre-K, but the parent needs after school, that funding can be used to pay for a spot in that private program, and that private program is working to meet the same standards as the public school program. So there are these efforts at reform. I don't want to leave people feeling hopeless. There's a lot of us in the community working really, really hard on making this better.
Gail, there was actually sorry to interrupt, there was actually a question about the Build Back Better program, that there's been some criticism of it because too much of the money will benefit middle and upper middle income families rather than families that are living in poverty. And just wondering, you mentioned it, so I was wondering what your thoughts are about its focus.
Yeah, it's a very complicated thing, as with any legislation. And I've tried to really dig deep and understand it. I think there's often that legislators feel like if they offer something that's universal and not just targeted to the most low-income people, it will be better utilized. It will be more likely to get funded because people perceive it as
Sorry. That was my fault.
So yes, I can see those criticisms. I don't think it's a panacea for everything. So I await with curiosity to see what it actually turns out to be, how it trickles down, and what it looks like. I don't think it's like the answer to everyone's dreams. There's lots of implications. If there's more public pre-K, for example, and the pre-K slots, which cost less in a private program, are what actually allow them to offer infant and toddler care, what does that change do to our private supply? So you tinker with any part of the system and it affects all of it. So
I don't know if you're ready for questions, Gail. That was my doing. I'm sorry, I was trying to get it so folks could unmute themselves. But
I would love to take questions. These are some resources.
Oh, great. Good.
Afterwards, just these are things that will help parents who are looking for care with applications to find out what's available, to find out about scholarships, subsidies, ratings, licensing reports, so I can send this out.
That's great. I did have someone ask a question about where they could find a breakdown of the centers that provide subsidy slots. Was that on that list?
It is on that list. You can go to, if you go to childcareva.com, that's a website. It used to be through Department of Social Services, but it's now through the Department of Education. There's a purple button that says search for care. You can put in your locality and you can click off whether you want center, home-based, and there's a little box that says subsidy provider. If you check that box, you will get a list of all the programs that provide subsidy. It will tell you ages and what their hours are. So that's one way to find out.
Great, that's helpful. Thank you. One other question that just came through the chat early on was about the whether you're familiar with the NICHD and the Quebec study, research studies that are out there.
Which study is it?
The NICHD and Quebec study.
Oh, in Quebec. I'm a little bit familiar with that. I think, yes, but it's a organization. Yeah.
If any of the participants have questions, you're able to unmute yourselves now. You could chime in, or you're welcome to put them into the chat, and I can take them from there.
I hope that this has created some empathy, both for parents and for providers. We sometimes see people blaming each other, and I just want to make clear that, you know, it's the system often at fault. There may be individual cases of, you know, parents who don't pay, who don't pick up their kids, who are, you know, sort of bad actors, and providers who, you know, aren't doing what they should. But for the most part, on both sides, it's a struggle. So, you know, that's my goal, is to try to help put participants sort of in both shoes and see why there may be tensions that drive parents into situations that are not great for children, driving them into, you know, foster care and some of the things that you may come across, and why, you know, people get frustrated that there's not enough care and not enough high quality care.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it certainly, you gave us just the picture of what this is, reality for the families in our area. And there are a few more questions coming through. One was, how do you think the situation is for providers locally? Not sure what you think
Yeah,
about
I mean,
that.
one of the biggest issues right now is staff shortages, like we hear in most industries, you know, whether it's restaurants or stores, there aren't enough staff, which means that they have to close classrooms. If you quarantine on top of that, they're having, you know, it's very hard to provide the consistent service that working families need. So I will say that we have amazing providers in this community who are working and still providing joyful, high quality, beautiful early care and education to children at, you know, in home-based programs, in center-based programs, school-based programs. There are great things going on, but the system is incredibly stressed, and they're in danger of not being able to sustain what they're doing because they're so overworked.
Yeah. I think maybe time for one last question, unless another quick one comes through. But do you know, Gail, how much DSS supports families financially in obtaining childcare after custody has been awarded to them, or do they provide that kind of help?
If I'm understanding it, if it's after a parent regains custody of their children, are they still eligible for childcare subsidy? And I know there are foster care funds. There's one type of childcare subsidy through foster care, and there's more general subsidy. And so I think they would possibly be eligible to continue getting a subsidy based on their income and the other eligibility factors, if I'm understanding that question correctly. So I think there's different pots of childcare subsidy funds. So.
Okay, that's great. Well, Gail, thank you. I think this has been just so interesting. And I hesitate to use the word interesting because it has really kind of pulled at my heartstrings, and I know the heartstrings of others, about the circumstances of families living in our neighbors and the families that live around us. So thank you. And had a few requests for those slides, so hopefully you can send those to me, and then we can make those available as a link and follow up with folks too. But thank you, Gail, and thank you all for being here. And we'll hopefully see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Looks like folks are rolling off.
Okay. Well, I will send you my PowerPoint.
That's great. Thank you. This was really, it was just really helpful to have this picture for our volunteers. And so I appreciate it. If there's anything we can ever do to help with ReadyKids or to partner in other ways, don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you. And likewise, please, I've had some of your volunteers call at times.
Great.
Happy to, advise or point them to resources for families. So
Wonderful. Well,
all
have
right.
a great
Thank
rest
you,
of your
Kate.
day.
You too. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.